Everyone, Mike Radzicki here from Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and I'm here today with Professor Steve Keen from University of Western Sydney in Australia. Professor Keen, Steve, is visiting with us here at WPI for a few days, and as long as we had him here, I thought we'd get him in the TV studio and ask him a few questions. Those of you who are watching this and have taken or are presently taking my distance learning course in macroeconomic dynamics will remember that Professor Keen's models are used extensively in the course, and we're going to have an opportunity today to talk to him about some of those models and some other issues in economics. So welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Mike.
Very glad to have you here. Also today we have some guests in the audience. Suleiman Ba and Hayo Parada are going to be joining us a little later in the session to ask some questions of Steve Keen, as well as we have some questions from the distance learning students, and we'll get to those later. But first, we're going to do a little bit of an interview here. So, Steve, if you will, can we begin by talking about, or having you talk about your background? How did you get interested in economics? Maybe you could talk a little bit about your bachelor degree days, your master degree days, and then your doctoral work.
Yep. Well, if I go back to when I started as at school, when your intellectual curiosity often begins as a young kid, I was a science fiction addict. I think I finished all the books on sci-fi inside my local library by the age of 9, and got into physics, and I was teaching myself things like Einstein's theory of relativity, the special, not the general, in primary school, and bored to death by primary school teaching. Couldn't wait to get to science in high school, and then had 6 consecutive years of, unfortunately, lousy science teachers who just, they drove my interest out. So I would have gone into nuclear physics were it not for bad teaching, effectively, uninspiring teaching, mundane stuff, which was a negative influence that I think hopefully has become a positive one in how I try to approach teaching later on. And so I had no idea of what I was going to do by the time I got towards the end of university, started doing economics, and I had a fabulous economics teacher in my second last year at high school. And as part of that, I got interested in economics in the final years before I had enough bad teaching to drive the interest out of me. And B, he came in and gave a brilliant presentation on Rostow's theory of economic growth. Now, I don't necessarily...
That's Walt Rostow.
Walt Rostow. So the whole idea of the flows was embedded there before I realized that actually happened in year 11 at high school, and year 12 was the last year. Got to university, and I had this background and strong interest in mathematics, and a strong feeling that there had to be something about flows and causal processes as part of your economic modelling. But I was also a complete believer in what I see as the ideological myth of neoclassical economics. So I walked in being anti-union, anti-monopoly, all the various things that come out of being a complete convert to neoclassical thinking, and arrived at Sydney University in 1971, date myself, and at that stage we had a lecturer called Frank Stilwell, who was taking the first year class, who was a fantastic teacher. Not mathematically strong, but very fantastic communicator, and someone who also was concerned about the logical consistency of what he was not only had learned, but he was also teaching us. So in the middle of the second session, I mentioned this in the preface to the book, middle of the second term of 3 terms, he introduced us to the theory of the second best, Lancaster's theory. Yeah. And that was in the context of, if you have a perfectly competitive labour market and a perfectly competitive set of employers, then you will get, the equilibrium wage being the marginal product of labour, etc., etc. However, if you have a monopoly purchaser of labour, or a more powerful aggregated firm sector, and you have disaggregated workers, then they'll be driven below. They will get their marginal revenue product, not their marginal product. And then if you decide to abolish, if you start from a position of union versus monopoly, then you will get a bargaining between those two extremes. So the wage will now fall between ripping off the workers and ripping off the firm, but it's a power relation. And if you abolish, you will actually go to the worst situation where the workers get done in. And I just looked at that and thought, good grief, what I thought was a strong argument in favour of competition everywhere showed that if you take one step closer to that nirvana ideal, you actually produce a worse situation. And I thought, this is crazy, not just because it undermined the logic, but also it showed how fragile the logic was. So that was the real big chink in my armour. And by the end of first year, I'd gone from being a complete believer in the myth of the free market, and I call it a myth, but I'm talking about the theory rather than what the practice tends to be. I think the practice could be much, much better than the theory myth implies. And I found myself organising a conference in radical economics in my second year at uni. So the big transformation occurred then. That then led to, in the context of the ending of the Vietnam War and all that jazz at university, we pulled out of the Vietnam War in the end of 72, and we had a change of government. And all this energy that was there opposing the Vietnam presence suddenly had in many ways, and it manifested itself in protest by students about the nature of what we're being taught. And this was not just in economics, but also philosophy and architecture became centres of protest about the nature of the teaching. And I got swept up in all that, and we ultimately formed what's called the political economy movement at Sydney University, and that led to the formation of the School of Political Economy some years later. So that was my old background. I finished university. This is the long version, mate. I was the first member of my family ever to go to university, so I didn't believe I had the intellectual capacity to be an academic. And anybody who feels that they're outside the realm there, don't underestimate yourself. That is my lesson there. Went to working as doing a law degree, bored to death by law. I finished the degree but dropped out of the program effectively, became a school teacher, then got a job in overseas aid, working as an education officer for a third world aid organisation, a charity.
Kind of doing economics.
Doing it in a sense, but then what I found was I was between a rock and a hard place in the sense that when I would try to advise this organisation on how to alter government policy was being set by people who believed in the free market. So all the people who lost the battle at Sydney University, in effect, had got themselves a job in the bureaucracy and had mentors there as well. And the whole paradigm was about how if we want to cause development, we have to simply bring in free trade. But at the other extreme, I found myself surrounded by what I call cardboard cutout Marxists. At the other extreme, I had a very boring interpretation of Marx as their vision of revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. And I thought both sides were off with the fairies in various ways. So I kept in touch with the economic literature. I saw a couple of things I thought should be done by that literature. I waited for it to turn up. It wasn't happening. And I was forever having to concede first base to either cardboard cutout Marxists at one extreme or neoclassical believers at the other. And I ultimately got so frustrated by the whole experience, a few other job changes, but I decided I had to go back and take this on its own ground. So I went back and did my master's in 87, starting in 87, finished in 90, I think. And actually, no, I got that quite wrong. No, that's right, 87, 90. And the focus there was on Marx's theory of value, because I believe that had a flaw and could be turned into a far richer foundation for economics, which I then did.
But let me just stop you just as a point. My students have access to your master's thesis, which I think I probably got off of your website.
Yep.
It's optional. It's not mandatory for them, but I urge them to take a look at it.
Okay. That was called Use Value, Exchange Value, and the Misinterpretation of Marx's Theory of Value. So I think that undermines, when you look at Marx's philosophy properly, you undermine the labour theory of value, but you get a very rich vision of the interactions in a capitalist system. So that's my intellectual foundation. Then, again, a chance to encounter with a good teacher. I think the important thing about good teachers is often simply inspiration, giving you an opening that you can follow. And I had a great lecturer called Bill Junor at New South Uni. Bill's now in Macquarie University in Sydney. And he set an exam question where you had to take a particular great book and write a comment on it, and he had a copy of Hyman Minsky's John Maynard Keynes. And something had been my reading I'd remembered about Minsky, so I said, I'll do that book. And I was hooked. And then my PhD thesis became putting Minsky's views into a mathematical format.
That's great. Again, for those of you taking my class, you probably are presently taking the class. You haven't encountered it yet, but at some point you will see some of Hyman Minsky's stuff on financial instability. And it's funny, there's an old adage on Wall Street that it takes 2 years for a Wall Street firm to unbrainwash a traditionally trained economist about efficient markets and the like. So the attitude on Wall Street towards professional economists isn't very good, except asterisk Hyman Minsky. Yep. They think he's the only professional economist who kind of figured it out and had things correct. Well, that's a very interesting background, and I'm struck by the importance in your life of good teachers and how they directed you from one discipline to another, inspired you, and so forth. And so for all of us in the teaching business, we might want to pay attention to that comment.
We have an impact. We have an impact.
Yeah.
I think it's always important to remember being a student when you're a teacher. And I get that feeling from you. Pardon, praising the interviewer, but I do. And that's very important. You've got to always maintain that contact with your students in that sense. Remember when you were one, what's it like to be treated in a particular way. Right.
Excellent. So, Steve, I'm going to switch gears a little bit now, and I'm going to give a little bit of background in this question for the benefit of my students. And in the course, I kind of talk about this from time to time, but just to sum up, I'll tell a little bit of a story here, and then I'd like your reaction to it.
Yeah.
The course is centered a lot around orthodox versus heterodox macrodynamics. And sort of a history of thought course looking at the various debates among the orthodox and heterodox economists over time. And generally speaking, heterodox economists say, well, we object to the orthodoxy, to mainstream economics, because those guys fail to look outside their window, get out from behind their desks, and find out what's really going on in the economy. And they say, for example, people are not maximizing rational, like traditional theory would say, and all you have to do is talk to any psychologist, and he or she will say, yeah, that's crazy. People don't do that. They are biased in their decision making. They anchor and adjust. They use rules of thumb. They use information that might not be the best information, but they're comfortable with it, so they use that information, etc. The heterodox economists say that, hey, history matters, that you have to use historical time, not logical time, as Mrs. Robinson would say. They would say that the institutional details of the economy are very important to understanding why people make their economic decisions, because they make them in part on the basis of the rules of the game, how others expect them to behave, and so forth. And to disregard all that is crazy. You can't explain what's going on. And of course, the orthodox economists, the economists who dominate the profession say, no, we disagree with this, that logic is the way to explain things, the Descartesian view of explanation, that observation can be fraught with biases and inaccuracies. You know, the old Margaret Mead idea, you go to the South Sea Island and you live with the indigenous people and observe them. Well, they say to observe is to disturb. You know, if you're among them, they're not going to behave the same way. If you ask people what they're doing, how they're making their decisions, they might be well-meaning and try to say what they do, but they can be incorrect, biased, and whatever. So you have to use logic to explain things. The orthodoxy likes to say, hey, don't criticize our models for unrealistic assumptions about maximizing rational behavior or whatever, because models by definition are not real. So how can you criticize my unreal model by saying its assumptions are not realistic? They'll say the key to modeling is prediction, and not prediction of individual behavior, but firm-level data, household-level data, or macro data. And that as long as the model predicts well, it's as if the assumptions are true, even if they're not really true. That is a good model. And lastly, they typically will argue, and I know you know all this, but for the benefit of the students, they'll typically argue that Occam's razor should be used, that the simplest model, the simplest explanation for something is the best. So you don't want complicated, institutional-rich historical models. You want simple laws that hold at any time, at any place, and aren't tied to the institutional details of the situation or the current time period. And therefore, economics is a science like, let's say, physics is. So with that background, what do you think about all that?
I think it's most, I can't think of the right analogy, but it's the old shell and pea trick will do. It's moving the object so quickly that you can't actually see where the argument is, and whenever you get close to pulling it out, there's then a little trapdoor that they jump their way out of to avoid the critique. So to start with the logic point of view, I'm wholly in favour of logic. And logic means you start a particular point and you get to a point where things don't work out. You don't jump over that and keep on going as though it wasn't there. Now, of course, that's what, unfortunately, neoclassical economics does all the time. So Chapter 4 of my book on debunking economics, the one I titled Size Does Matter, that takes the neoclassical theory of competitive markets and shows that logically it's impossible to have a downward-sloping demand curve and simultaneously a horizontal demand curve for the individual firm under the assumptions of Marshallian competition. It's feasible under Corno, but not under Marshall. And the reaction I've got to that has been absolutely vilific, which surprised me even more so when I realized that the argument wasn't originally made by me. It was originally made by George Stigler, one of the staunchest neoclassicals, in 1957, when I was 4 years old at the time. That's how long that argument's been there, and it's incontrovertible within the framework of the Marshallian model, and that's what they should be teaching. So there's duplicity. They make a statement which the logical result is the opposite of what they teach. So if they were logical, a huge part of what I protest about in neoclassical economics would not be there. The theory would be totally different, though, in many, many ways. So, first of all, the logic defense is not a defense because they don't use logic. They use logic and then wishful thinking and logic on the other side of the wishful thinking. And most of the time that wishful thinking is how they get from an analysis which is sound at the individual level but doesn't work at the aggregate level. Now, my particular critique about the individual firm, that's in other words, going in the reverse direction. When they start with the level of the overall firm and the market facing a downward sloping demand curve, given how they assume individuals behave, which is the atomistic competition, they cannot get to the individual that they'd like to do. And then if you aggregate up from that, you can't get to where they start from. So the aggregation flaw is there. The Cambridge controversies is another area. If they did that properly, they would have, they couldn't have the marginal product of capital being the rate of interest. That's just not possible with the Cambridge controversies. And more importantly, the Sonnenschein-Mandel-de Breuer critique about the nature of the individual demand curve. You can have downward sloping demand curves for the individual, strictly obeying all the neoclassical concepts. And when you aggregate, you will get a demand curve that has any shape whatsoever. It does not, the market demand curve doesn't have the properties of the individual unless the individuals are identical and commodities are also identical. Now, that to me means, well, logic implies that you can't have market intersecting demand and supply curves. But that's what they show next, so they're not being logical. So scratch that particular defense. Then go to the empirical one and saying you can't trust what people say. That I see as a cop-out, because the same thing applies to psychologists. They have a hard time saying, does somebody, what they say they see, does that correspond to what they're actually doing behind there? And psychologists have spent a lot of time working out how to do experimental work that verifies what happens. So, for example, with someone playing a piano, the stimulus response theory, which used to dominate psychology, would say that there was a stimulus which was the response comes first. You press the keys, you then hear the note back here, and then you know what to do next. And there's this feedback mechanism going back that far. But when doing neuroscience applied to psychology, they found that the length of time it would take for that signal to make it back up to the brain, be processed and lead back down here was too long. The time delay could not explain the performance of even a mediocre pianist, let alone a concert pianist. So they had to change that. And behaviorism as a result, which was dominant and very similar in its philosophical foundations to neoclassical economics, that died in psychology because of a proper approach to experimentation, what people say they do, and what's feasible. We're capable of doing the same thing, and it's a cop-out to say that you can't do that with the empirical information. You swamped me with the other three, but I'll...
Okay, sorry, information overload. Trying to drink from a fire hose.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Cambridge controversy, so let's switch gears a teeny bit and go back to those. As I know you know, and you write very eloquently in your book, and I was going to introduce the book later, but since you've mentioned it a couple times, I want to just show the book. It's Debunking Economics by Steve Keen, and the subtitle is The Naked Emperor of the Social Sciences, which is actually a wonderful title. I recommend this book to anyone in my class or elsewhere to get a different take on the economics profession. And in here, among other things, you write about the Cambridge controversies, and I wanted you to talk a little bit more about them. As you know, they're called that because in the 1950s and 60s, it was the University of Cambridge in UK, principally Mrs. Robinson, Luigi Passanetti, and I don't think Piero Sraffa weighed in explicitly, but they used a lot of his ideas against MIT, Modigliani, Samuelson, and Solo, principally at Cambridge, MIT. And it was a long, somewhat bitter controversy.
Extremely.
And I like it because, like you do in your book, they said, you want to play on the logic field? Okay, we'll play that. We'll do logic. And,
bare knuckles.
Bare knuckles, and we'll see where the logic leads. And so I want you to talk about that in just 1 minute. But last comment is I did speak to an MIT-trained, in the 1960s, economist who was there as a student during the Cambridge controversies. And I asked him, well, what did you think about that? And he goes, oh, those things, oh, they're long over and we won. So what do you think about the Cambridge controversy?
Well, they lost. They clearly lost, and Samuelson admits that in what he says in the eulogy after Schrafer's death. It was a fairly mealy-mouthed eulogy, but he certainly conceded that the Cambridge MIT lost the debate to Cambridge UK, and this was really over two concepts. It was over the idea of an aggregate production function, and the idea that the return to capital is the marginal product of capital, just as in the neoclassical theory the return to labour is the marginal product of labour. Now, it's a very complicated thing to try to understand, and I really only understood it myself fully when I had to sit down with debunking economics. I knew I had to cover that area, and I said, how do I communicate this to somebody in non-mathematical language? And then struggling through trying to do that, I finally got the basis for the critique. Because if you look at the initial book that gave us the critique, it was Schrafer's Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. And as a good friend of mine, Peter Kreisler, emphasises all the time, Schraffer was an absolute pedant. He fought for a month over the location of a comma in Ricardo's collected works with his co-author, Dobb. And the subtitle is therefore very important. And the subtitle is Prelude to a Critique of Economic Theory. I'm not sure about the last part. It certainly is Prelude to a Critique. So what he was doing in that book was setting out a clear way of measuring, because he said with trying to understand all the logic of neoclassical theory, one has to be able to measure various concepts such as capital. And the important thing in working out a marginal product of capital theory of the return to capital is you have to be able to measure the amount of capital. So he showed that, first of all, you can work out what he called a standard commodity, and that's the hardest part of the book to comprehend. But once you've got a standard commodity, it means you have a very strict linear relationship between the rate of profit that is actually earned by capitalists, the maximum rate of surplus the system can generate, and the wage that the workers get measured in terms of that standard commodity, where if the wage is 0, then all the surplus goes to capitalists. If the wage is 1, then all the surplus goes to workers, and there's something in between the two. Using that concept, you can then reduce capital to what's called dated labour. So you can say the watch that I'm wearing here can be broken down into the labour that was needed to make the watch plus the components that existed before the watch was assembled 1 year ago. And then you can take my labour to one side, and then take the capital a year ago and say those components were made using inputs a year before that, or time period before that, plus the labour then. So you keep on doing that, and you're trying to eliminate the capital component. You can never get rid of it completely, but you can reduce the actual capital in this watch to dated labour. Then you get a relationship between when the labour was applied, that becomes measured as capital some years later, and the rate of profit at that time. And you then find that the amount of capital you measure that you've got depends upon the rate of profit in a very non-linear way. So to get this clear measure of capital is impossible. And in fact, the best analogy I can give is producing wine. Let's say, and apologies to all the wine buffs out there, okay, but let's say if somebody develops a technique where they can instantly do, in a manufacturing process, like in a matter of days, what's necessary to make wine taste like something which has been sitting there with bacterial processes going on for a century in the best vineyards in Bordeaux. Well, if you can do it, you can have a gleaming modern factory, highly capital intensive. But if you look at the wine factory in Bordeaux, 100 years ago, that's going to have had somebody making a wine barrel with chisel and saw and stuff like that, and latching it together and so on, and that's going to be the wine barrel. So you've got two ways of making wine, one with a really modern plant made 1 year ago, and taking wine as an input, plus this highly stainless steel technology everywhere, versus this little cask made 100 years earlier. Now, which one has more capital? Well, that's actually a question that depends upon the rate of profit that's applied for all those years. So looking at it, people say, oh, of course, it's the stainless steel factory. But if the rate of profit was 25%, let's say, and that was almost the maximum rate of profit that you could earn, then that every year the amount you'd value that the capital inside that wine barrel made a century ago is going to be that 25% raised to the power of the rate of the number of years. So if you have 1 plus 0.25 raised to the power of 100 at that very high rate of profit, that wine barrel is going to be valued as capital, as absolutely far outweighing the stainless steel stuff made just a year ago. But if you drop the rate of profit to 1%, then that amount at 1.01 raised to the power of 100 isn't so big anymore, and maybe this thing has got more capital in it. So the amount you measure you've got depends upon your rate of profit, and you've got an unavoidable circularity between the rate of profit and the amount of capital you've got. And therefore you cannot get that resolution that says the return to capital is the marginal product of capital, because you can't define it in any clear sense. Therefore, as the classical school used to argue, the rate of return on capital is a surplus, and we should be having surplus analysis. That's how we should be analysing capitalism. That workers get paid a wage in some sense, however that's determined, socially determined, and what profits get is a surplus above the cost of production plus what they're forced to pay to workers through income distribution. And it reasserts the classical approach to economics over the neoclassical.
Right. So to sum up, I guess the Cambridge controversies were a lot about the idea of income distribution in society, that the neoclassical, the traditional theory says basically you're paid according to the value that the next worker adds to the pie. It has nothing to do with how hard you work, but rather if you're low paid, it's because the nth worker is contributing very little value.
Well, in fact, I'd go back to your previous starting point. The theory collapses everything to what the market determines and says the market determines everything, including distribution of income. And by Schaffer showing this didn't happen to capital, then you're saying, no, you've got to know the distribution of income independently from what happens in the market. So you can't collapse distribution into the market structure. And that applies to wages as well. So therefore, you can't say everything, the price is right. Sorry, the price is right given the distribution of income, which might be right or wrong, depending on your ideological position. You cannot eliminate arguments over distribution of income as a neoclassical theory tries to do.
Right. Now, one other thing I wanted you to talk briefly about, it's not really part of the traditional Cambridge controversies. It came a little later, but it certainly is in that genre, is the humbug production function. And I want you to talk about that because the students in my class learn how to build models with Cobb-Douglas and CES production functions with system dynamics, as well as Leontief production functions or other ways of modeling economic relations. So can you tell everybody about the humbug?
Okay, well, let's Anwar Sheikh's done a brilliant job of partly developing and very much publicising the idea of humbug production function. Anwar and I have had a few fights on other topics, but I take my hat off to him in this particular one. I think it's an economist called Atkinson who actually first pointed it out, but certainly Anwar did the major job in putting it in a very concise framework. And that is that one thing you'll see if you look at people like Mankiw when they talk about neoclassical theory, they use the Cobb-Douglas production function with constant returns to scale, CES. All the time, and part of they'll talk about the objections people make to the idea of smooth substitutability of capital to labour and so on and so forth. But ultimately they'll say, yeah, but look how good the fit is. If we take a look at empirical data in every country, then we can fit it really closely with the Cobb-Douglas production function.
And excuse me for interrupting, but in general, in traditional economics, fitting models to data tightly is a big deal.
It is a big deal, yeah. Well, what Anwar showed is that if you take a look at most economies, the standard reality is that there's not a great deal of change in the distribution of income from one year to the next. And if you take the identity that net income equals profits plus wages, y equals pi plus w, and you take that under the circumstances of a constant labour share of income, comparatively constant, then you can derive the Cobb-Douglas production by simply manipulating y equals pi plus w. So the close fit they get is the correlation of y with y. Well, duh, of course you're going to get it. So it's one of the beautiful things to show that what looks like a great fit is a great fit because you're fitting, you're regressing Mike Radzicki on Mike Radzicki. If you regress him on me, you might get some differences. The guy's got broader shoulders than I have. We'd have a few divergences there. But regress him on him, you'll get a pretty high correlation.
Right.
And that's what it falls down to. And the beauty that Anwar, and this is why I think it's a fantastic concept, he wrote the word humbug on a graph. And he then took the data points for humbug. The top H has got 8 data points and so on. And he showed that he could fit that to a Cobb-Douglas production function. Well, therefore, the Cobb-Douglas production function is humbug. It doesn't explain anything.
Another example of debunking economics, I guess. Right. Okay, that's great stuff. Now let me switch gears just a little bit here. I'm looking at my notes. Oh, I know what I wanted to talk about. The students in my class hear a lot about this, quote-unquote, the start of modern growth theory with Sir Roy Harrod. Now, we can debate when growth theory really started. It might have started with Smith, Ricardo, and Malthus. But in terms of sort of the modern idea of growth theory, allegedly Sir Roy Harrod's 1939 model is the starting point. And of course, there's a big controversy around that. Harrod always claimed he was modeling the trend and the cycle together, which is, if you look outside your window, what economies do. They grow and oscillate at the same time. There's this interaction between the trend and the cycle. But at least some economists would look at his 1939 paper and say, well, basically you've got the trend and no cycle there. And Harrod, to his dying day, from 1939 till, I believe he passed away in 78, but his last paper, I believe, was 75, he was still trying to explain what he meant with his Harrod model. And he really didn't like the knife edge or the razor's edge. He said that's not right. There's a trend in the cycle here. You don't have this golden age growth path that if the economy is knocked off, it falls away and never returns. Yes, it returns. I know that. So Sir John Hicks offered a fix to Harrod's problem and the knife edge. And you don't like that, and you've offered your own fix. So could you talk to the students about that?
Well, let's say it's not Sir John. It was J.R. Hicks, J.R. the Junior and Sir John the Elder. And as often happens, not often enough, unfortunately, but frequently happens with neoclassical economists, they get to their maturity and they suddenly look back at their youth and think, my God, what do I believe back then? And they then do something worthwhile. So the J.R. did a lot of damage. John tried to correct some of it. So back when he was J.R., Hicks,
the young John.
The young John took a look at Hicks's model and the Harrod's model, and the problem with Harrod is he never had the mathematical sophistication to pull off what he was trying to do. And I might add just one little point here. In correspondence with Richard Goodwin, after he reviewed my paper on Harrod for the Economic Journal very favourably, it got turned down because the other referee didn't like the fact that I hadn't quoted his book, and therefore the paper got rejected from the EJ. Richard told me that he actually suggested the idea of unstable growth to Harrod, and then Harrod came out with that paper. So, and he was actually rather, Richard Goodwin struck me as an incredibly self-effacing man, but he was actually quite annoyed by the way Harrod didn't acknowledge any feed-in from his argument. And of course, Goodwin had the capacity to build a model of cyclical growth, which he later did. Harrod never really had the mathematics, and I think if you look at the work he did, it was a real struggle. There's no real development between the 39 paper and the last thing he wrote. He just rearranged a few little algebraic expressions. So it's a real sign you need to have the technical prowess to be able to carry these ideas forward. He didn't have it. He also objected to having talked about as the knife edge. I've forgotten the particular author's paper, but you read Harrod, there's a knife edge there. Whatever he might say, not liking about how it's characterized, that's how he described it. He didn't use those particular terms, but as I saw one author say, if it's not a knife edge, then what the hell is it? So it's there. But the thing which Harrod did have was the strong belief, and I think it's quite valid, that the forces that give you growth can also cause cycles. Now, in your course, students certainly learn how that can come about. Accelerate growth too much, you're going to overshoot, you're going to have instability, equilibria can be unstable, we know that now very well. But back in Harrod's day, Hicks in particular, and most economists still, do not realize that an equilibrium can be unstable, but the system doesn't break down because it's nonlinear. And nonlinearities constrain how far it can move away from the equilibrium. So what Hicks did was say, well, let's just take this model, which Harrod pretty much expressed in continuous terms, though not really as differential equations as it should have been, turn it back into a difference equation, and then let's apply Keynes's identity of savings and investment and work out a second order, as he worked out a second order difference equation model. When I looked at that model, back as my student days, my master's days, I realized that he'd equated, effectively, a model, expression for desired investment to another one, which was quite bastardized, it wasn't sound, for actual savings.
Can I interrupt you just quickly, Steve? For the students, you guys are studying the Samuelson-Hicks multiplier accelerator model. That's what he's referring to.
That's the one. Yeah. There's no economic theory by Keynes or anybody else that says desired investment equals actual savings. So when you look at that equation, the yt plus 2 equals 1 minus s plus c times yt plus 1 minus c times yt, that is what that equation is saying is under what circumstances will desired investment equal actual savings if they are both causally related to the current level of output? The answer is no output whatsoever. In other words, that is the solution to the trivial equation. And if you then take matrix methods and convert that into a matrix equation, when you're doing a true dynamic model, your matrix equation will have a determinant of 0, and the solution to the determinant of 0 will give you a characteristic equation which gives you, n, where n's the power of the difference equation, n potential eigenvalues and eigenvectors out of it. Well, that requires the matrix can't be inverted. The matrix for the Samuelson, Domar, so-called Hicks-Hansen model can be inverted. So the only solution is that the vector of outputs has to be 0. So a simple bit of, again, simple mathematical knowledge, you apply it to that model, you see, this isn't a model. It only gives you the trivial outcome. So having done that, I then said, well, is there any way to make this more of a systems model? And then I said, okay, let's start from the argument. First of all, let's use Hicks's argument for what investment was. So investment now is some constant multiplied by the change in output in the previous 2 periods. Well, when investment occurs, it gets added to capital stock. So I've now got a system flow going on. So investment is the flow, capital is the stock.
So you added a third stock.
Added a third stock. Then you've got output. Then you have a relationship between the stock of capital and the flow of output. So output in time t is the capital stock divided by the accelerator, and you feed that back into the system, and you get a third order difference equation which is linear, but much to my amazement, it's actually linear with cycles. And you can actually differentiate out an equilibrium term, a growth term, and a cycle term out of it. You can decompose in the sense you can with a linear model. But the result you get is a system that reproduces both what Harrod had to talk about, which was growth and cycles being co-determined, but also what Hicks talked about, the system is stable in the sense that it doesn't break down.
So how do you think that this has led the economics profession to divorce the trend from the cycle and teach courses in business cycle theory that are distinct and separate from courses in growth theory, and even books on the topics as though they're completely separate, or if it's in the same book, they're separate chapters?
Yeah. That's what really, again, Hicks has the major responsibility there, because Harrod was really fighting to say we have to contain the two together. We have to have a joint explanation of these phenomena. And Hicks comes along and trashes the theory of unstable growth that Harrod had. I mean, Hicks's system has an equilibrium of 0, so goodbye growth. Then to get cycles, he imposes the idea of shocks from the outside and the accelerated type relationship C being less than 1, which is crazy. It's normally measured between 2 and 4. And then he brings in growth externally as exogenous growth at the natural rate, where natural, as usual for a neoclassical economist, means absolutely going gangbusters, the fastest rate the economy can maintain without breaking down. It's like saying the natural speed of your car is whatever it does when you've taped the accelerator to the floor. That ain't natural. And so we then have this divergence. So you study the natural rate of growth, what causes that in one subject, and you study cycles in another with exogenous shocks and the Frisch paradigm. So yeah, I do see that particular point as being where we could have gone the joint path, and we didn't. And by the time you had people soundly doing that, really the first one being, well, in a verbal sense, Kaldor, after that paper by Hicks, and then but mathematically the best model being Goodwin. By the time that happened, it was part of a minority interest. So the majority had split off growth into one thing, cycles into another, and we lost that cohesive view that, with the systems point of view, you're trying to bring back, and so am I.
Great. Steve, I have 2 more questions before we get the audience involved and bring in some student questions. My last one will be a fun question, but I got one more, a little bit serious question I'd like you to reflect on. And that is the state of the economics profession right now in light of, among other things, the post-autistic movement in economics. And when you reflect on that, could you also tie it to your current work?
Okay. I've seen a wonderful description, it may be in a piece of graffiti somewhere, but it possibly was in a paper as well, saying that most professions, like physics, for example, have got a core of professionals, and there'll be a lunatic fringe around the outside. Whereas in economics, there's a core of lunatics and a fringe of professionals on the outside trying to get in. And the trouble is the lunatics on the inside so much believe the myth they've put together and the mathematical awkwardness they've assembled to defend this myth that they don't take us seriously. We're on the outside. throwing stones. And the great dilemma for most of the history of economics has been that the neoclassicals on the inside have this mathematical prowess, apparent mathematical prowess, that they can be disparaging towards the lack of sophistication of those on the outside. And in a paper I wrote for one of the books Edward Fulbrook put together, I quote Walras talking about mathematical economics. It's quite a wonderfully French flowery phrase about those on the outside will produce both bad mathematics and bad economics. So standing on the outside of all this stuff, they've been leading themselves down this funnel of the non-empirical, illogical, ideologically obsessed funnel, while thinking at the same time with all those defences you mentioned before that they're sound. We've been saying, you're going the wrong way. This isn't how capitalism works, good or bad. This isn't the system we're in. So the post-autistic movement, again, is expressing the frustration that students feel when they've got to have this stuff imposed upon them, when they have any sense of the real world, and they suffer this serious cognitive dissonance. And normally, of course, the good students drop out. So the post-autistic movement, I think, is... Again, there's been protests of this nature about neoclassical economics going back prior to Veblen. So it's quite possible we'll all die and they'll still be doing the same old thing sometime down the track. The thing that gives me hope is that this time round, the physicists, on whom in many ways, as Murawski argued, neoclassical economics modeled themselves back in the 19th century, at the wrong time and before the physicists had developed concepts like entropy, that group has now gone through the dramatic transformations of theory of entropy and thermodynamics and also quantum mechanics and so on, got to the end of an enormous development period in physics which has given us the modern world, and are actually running out of work, as one of them quite frankly told me. So therefore the graduate students are being unleashed on the best large stream of data they can find that happens to be finance. So they're now becoming what they call econophysicists, but mainly devoted around finance data. And of course with their mathematical skills, which far exceed what any neoclassical economist learns, even the very top ones, far exceed what I have as mathematical power, they are now coming into economics from the outside with weaponry that just devastate the intellectual armour of neoclassical economics. So I hope that will lead to a gradual revolution so that we realise it's possible to be mathematical while still having the very strong empirical foundations that physicists insist upon. And hopefully we might finally become a science, because I think at the moment economics, I describe it pretty much as a pre-Galilean religion. It's not a science. And a large part of it because this insistence that we should not bother looking at the empirical data. I'm sorry. Whatever school of thought you belong to, you must make the empirical data your foundation. If you can't explain it, you've got a bad explanation. It's not the fault of the empirical data. So I have a hope that there's some chance for change. I'm not so much relying upon the post-autistic movement. I'm more relying upon the physicists.
Well, so you see a role not just in physics, though. You see a role for computational methods, such as nonlinear ordinary differential equations, simulation, system dynamics, possibly agent-based modeling, and these sorts of things. And so you're trying to do that sort of thing, apply those sorts of tools to financial crises, right?
Yeah. Again, Minsky had a wonderful verbal model, and ironically, Minsky's PhD thesis attempted to take the Hicks-Hansen-Samuelson model and make it something that generated cycles driven by the financial system. And his failure to do that wasn't his fault, obviously. He was using the wrong tool. He had a first degree in mathematics before he did economics. But I looked at it and thought, well, the idea is very clear, but that's the wrong foundation. And my preferred foundation was Goodwin's model of cyclical growth. So I thought I could take that and extend it, as I have done in the 1995 JPKE paper and a couple of other papers, to give a single commodity, the pseudo-money model of financial instability, which partly explains the data. In fact, like global warming, my model isn't as bad as the data's turning out to be. I do think we're facing a debt deflation. I really do think we're going to see a financial crisis caused in much the same sense that the 1930s crisis was caused in America, Australia, England, and some parts of the rest of the OECD, and I believe Japan has already been through that crisis, is now coming out the other side. So I want to have an explanation for that, and to make it work properly, I want to make an explanation that genuinely has money in there. So I'm taking the circuitous school of thought, brilliant initial idea about the nature of money, an inability to model it dynamically. I've managed to build a base dynamic model which gives me endogenous money growth. I then want to incorporate the Minsky model within that, so I've got genuine monetary flows going on, and I hope to be able to produce a model of multisectoral production as well, which is probably the most difficult thing I intend doing, and possibly also going from that, from where I'm now working, it's still in ordinary differential equations, but multidimensional production, to stochastic differential equations. Now, I don't know that I can do that. I certainly can't do it in closed form. But that would give me a systems down view of the way in which financial instability occurs. And I want to have that in a comprehensible framework. So again, it's a pretty weird ambition, but I'm trying to achieve something like what I did with debunking economics, to make it something which can be read by an ordinary non-mathematical reader, but to present it in a fashion that those who know the mathematics can derive the mathematical concept behind it, and it will be driven by a mathematical model, which I will try to calibrate but not fit to the data.
Great. One more fun question, Steve, before we get the audience involved and have a few student questions, and that is, given everything you've discussed, who is your favorite economist and why?
Okay. As I said in pre-conversation, I'd have to say it's three people, but if I was forced to pick between the three, to my amazement, actually, these days I'd probably say Schumpeter of the three. But Schumpeter, Marx, and Keynes would be my three. Minsky is there as the person who probably best brought them all together. And people don't realize this, but Minsky was affected by Marx in his reading. For God's sake, he had Communist Party parents. You know, that's why they met at a Communist Party function. That was part of his background. He never expressed it openly, but that was his foundation. If I thought the greatest economist of all time, even though he produced the labour theory of value and defended it and gave us that distortion, it would be Marx. But in terms of someone who took a model, a verbal model of the economy, how he saw the economy operating, and put that together in a coherent fashion and never lost the thread, then that's what Schumpeter did in the theory of economic development. And when you look at that, and you and I know the difficulty of putting together a model, a systems model that's coherent when we have the mathematical tools, to be able to do that in the verbal way that Schumpeter did in the theory of economic development and actually not lose the thread at any point and not fall off the track at any point is an amazing intellectual achievement. So I therefore rank Schumpeter ahead in terms of systemic thinking, and then Keynes is the most gifted, certainly the most gifted writer, and the one who had the most gifted feeling of the nature of people's behaviour and so on, and the role of uncertainty, but never quite got to be as cohesive as either Schumpeter or Marx. So my ranking would go Joseph first, Karl second, and John third. Great. And then Minsky trying to corral them all together, and I'm carrying on in the same light. And I've got to put a plug in for two more, if I can. Goodwin, Richard Goodwin, a very, unfortunately I would say, a very poor writer, and also misled about the role of money for reasons that he discussed with me a long time ago in correspondence, which I think was a false reading of the data. He actually said he did his PhD thesis on money between the wars, found it had no impact, and therefore ignored monetary dynamics and tried to talk me out of doing monetary analysis, and I disagreed. And a guy who most of you wouldn't have heard of, an Australian applied mathematician called John Blatt, B-L-A-T-T.
Yes.
And Blatt truly brought across.
Excuse me, our students do see some of his stuff in my course. Yeah.
Those are my heroes.
Great. Just as an anecdote on the side, some years ago when I was a little bit younger, I had dinner with Richard Goodwin, and he made the point that he probably is the only person in the world who was both Schumpeter's student and Schumpeter's teacher, because when Goodwin was a graduate student at Harvard in the 1930s and early 40s, I guess, or maybe he was an assistant professor there at the time. He had studied economics from Schumpeter, but Schumpeter was poor at mathematics, and Goodwin was very gifted in mathematics, and believe it or not, I believe it was during World War II, was asked to teach physics in the Harvard physics department as an economist, and he learned some more mathematics, dynamic mathematics from the physicists, and then Schumpeter said, look, if you teach a course in math, I'll sit in because I want to learn some math, and so I think that's a kind of a neat story. Well, Steve, thank you so much. I'd like to bring the audience down to ask some questions, and we're also going to have a few student questions, if that's okay. So if you guys can come down, that would be good at this point, and we'll adjust the cameras and things.
Pardon?
Yeah,
sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah.